Order. Before we begin, can I encourage members to wear masks when they're not speaking? This is in line with current government guidance and that of the House of Commons Commission. Please also give each other and members of staff space when seated and when entering and leaving the room. Miriam Coates to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And may I move the motion that this House has considered the vaccination of children against COVID-19. And can I also thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting this important debate and draw members' attention to the 3 e-petitions which relate to this topic and have between them amassed over 100,000 signatures. Madam Chairman, vaccination has transformed public health over the last 2 centuries. As a science teacher, I remember teaching students about the amazing work of Edward Jenner, who famously developed smallpox inoculation. 250 years later, vaccinations have again ridden to our rescue with the rapid development and rollout of the COVID vaccine across the UK. The phenomenal success of this vaccination programme can be seen clearly in the data. Of the 51,000 COVID-related deaths from January to July this year, 76% were of unvaccinated people, and a further 14% had had only a single dose. Just 59 deaths, 0.1%, were of double-vaccinated adults with no other risk factors, and 92% of adults now have COVID antibodies. These figures are a ringing endorsement of the JCVI's strategy to recommend vaccination based on the medical benefits and risks for the individuals concerned. The government has repeatedly defended this strategy and the independence of the JCVI, resisting calls to prioritise the vaccination of teachers or police officers over those with higher risks of serious illness. That was the right approach, and the UK has led the world in falling rates of deaths and hospitalisations. It was therefore surprising, to say the least, that the government put political pressure on the JCVI to reach a decision quickly about the vaccination of children. On the 3rd of September, the JCVI announced that they were unable to recommend the mass vaccination of healthy 12 to 15-year-olds. The reason for this was that although there are marginal health benefits of COVID vaccination to children based on the known risks of the vaccine, there is considerable uncertainty regarding the magnitude of the potential harms, such as the long-term effects of myocarditis. Writing in the Sunday Times, paediatrician and JCVI member Adam Finn says, "A high proportion of myocarditis patients show significant changes of the heart. It is perfectly possible that these changes will resolve completely over time, but it is also possible that they may evolve into longer-term changes. Until 3 to 6 months have passed, this remains uncertain, as does what impact on health any persistent changes may have." According to the JCVI, for every 1 million healthy children vaccinated, 2 ICU admissions will be prevented and 3 to 17 cases of myocarditis caused. With 2 doses, that rises to between 15 and 51 cases. Finely balanced indeed. There is no rush to roll out the vaccine to children. We know that children are not at risk from COVID. Teachers are no more at risk than the rest of the population. The vast majority of vulnerable adults have been vaccinated. Over half of children already have antibodies, and there is no evidence that schools drive transmission. I certainly will.
The Honourable Lady is making an excellent speech, and she's of course quite right that the government's vaccination rollout programme has been very positive. However, does she share my concerns about the message it sends out regarding parental authority if children as young as 12 years old are allowed to challenge their parents' decision regarding their vaccination?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I agree. I think there are some very difficult issues around parental consent and the vaccine, and whether any child can know enough about the potential benefits and potential risks. And I think this is going to be a very difficult question for schools, for health authorities and for parents. And I will say something more about that later on. I certainly will.
I thank her for giving way. Now, the advice being given out in terms of the forms for consent actually state on it that you get to see your family doctor. But when I and a colleague from Winchester have challenged the former vaccines minister on this about the accessibility of families to their family doctor to get advice for the vaccines, he could not and would not give that assurance families could have that advice. And isn't this necessary, especially if the government on the vaccine form is saying you do have that access?
Order, just before I call Miriam to continue, members ought to realise that when they say you, they're referring to the chair. Can we please try to get the formalities right? I know that it's less important on Zoom, but we're now back. Miriam Kate.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. And he is right, and it is widely known that access to GPs is challenging at the moment, and that also prevents challenges in this situation. And I think it's widely understood that if a child could consent, contrary to parental consent, that is not a tick-box exercise, and it must be a matter for a medical professional to assess whether the child is competent to consent. So there are clear issues there if there are problems accessing GPs. So there's no rush to roll out the vaccine, and there's no evidence that schools drive transmission, and indeed recorded COVID cases are now at their lowest level since June, despite schools being open for 2 weeks. It's also unlikely that vaccinating children will have a major impact on infection rates in the population as a whole. With the JCVI saying that, the committee is of the view that any impact on transmission may be relatively small, given the lower effectiveness of the vaccine against infection with the Delta variant. But instead of accepting the JCVI's assessment and waiting for more evidence to emerge, the government asked the Chief Medical Officer urgently to review the decision based on the wider benefits to children, including to education. And last week, the CMO announced that he would recommend child vaccinations on the basis of these wider benefits. This is a marked departure from the principle of vaccinating people for their own medical benefit, because these wider issues, educational disruption and concerns around mental health, are the consequences of policy decisions and not scientific inevitabilities. Children in the UK have already missed more education than almost any other country in Europe, despite comparable death rates. Since January 2020, British children have lost, on average, 44% of school days to lockdown and isolation. This is not a consequence of COVID infections in children, but rather a result of policy decisions to close schools and isolate healthy children. According to the government's own modelling, the vaccine could lead to 41 days of schooling saved per 1,000 children between October and March. This equates to an average of just 15 minutes of education saved per child over this period, surely an insignificant amount and negligible once accounting for the time taken to vaccinate and subsequent days off school to recover from potential side effects. There is a much more simple way to stop harmful educational disruption, and that is to follow the advice of the Royal College of Paediatricians and end the mass testing of asymptomatic children. This unevidenced and unethical policy is costing tens of millions of pounds a week. I'd be grateful if the Minister could confirm the exact cost, and is continuing to disrupt education. Even the CMO acknowledges that a vaccination programme alone won't stop school closures. So perhaps the Minister could clarify how the government does intend to end educational disruption. And on the potential mental health benefits from reducing the fear of COVID, it isn't COVID infection that is causing children fear. It's the uncertainty, frustration, loneliness and anxiety that they experience as a result of lockdowns and harmful messages such as "Don't kill Granny." Children need not fear catching COVID, but they have every right to fear policy decisions that cause them significant harm. And sadly, we can't vaccinate against those. Nonetheless, the decision has been made, and we have to be very clear that the risks to children, both of COVID and the vaccine, are tiny. Concerns should now focus on making sure that necessary safeguards are put in place as vaccination is rolled out. The previous Vaccines Minister assured MPs that there will be no differential treatment of children in schools as a result of their vaccination status. This is crucial because any suggestion that unvaccinated young people may be denied education or subjected to social disadvantage will inhibit the ability of both parents and children to make a free and objective decision. While I appreciate Minister's commitments, children are already facing discrimination in some schools over mask wearing and testing. We must also make sure that travel rules that differentiate between vaccinated and unvaccinated children do not amount to coercion when parents are making the decision. So can the Minister say how we will ensure that there is no discrimination in practice as well as in theory? Vaccination must be a free decision and it must be an informed decision. Choosing to have or not to have the vaccine are both perfectly reasonable and sensible decisions where children are concerned. So we must ensure that correct and impartial information is communicated and, as my honourable friend said, access to health professionals where necessary. Parental consent must also be respected, and much has been said on this subject. But the heart of the matter is that parental responsibility and parental authority is foundational to society. I am optimistic that these protections can and will be put in place. Nonetheless, the way that the decision to vaccinate healthy 12 to 15-year-olds has been made should give us pause for thought. For no other cohort has the government questioned the JCVI's advice. Why have we departed from this stance when it comes to children and looked for reasons other than direct medical benefit to press ahead? When there are concerns about future health of our children, why haven't we waited for more evidence to emerge? Rather than an isolated incident, I fear that this situation epitomises a worrying attitude to children that has been evident since the very start of the pandemic. Throughout the last 18 months, Protect the Vulnerable has been our clarion call. We have rightly made significant efforts to protect elderly people and those who are particularly susceptible to COVID. But children who can't speak out, who don't own property, have no legal agency, are also very vulnerable. Yet during the pandemic, we've asked this group of vulnerable people to make huge sacrifices to protect the rest of us. The harms of lockdown for our children are significant and for many will be irreversible. Lost education, missed opportunities, abuse, horrific online harms. The number of children presenting in A&E with acute mental health conditions has risen 50% since the start of the pandemic. A climate of fear and uncertainty has robbed children of the structure, routine and security that we know they need to thrive, and placed upon them a heavy emotional burden in inferring that they may be responsible for the deaths of those they love. We've pretended that online learning is somehow a substitute for being in school and closed our eyes to the consequences of social isolation for children and young people. Of course, we should raise our children to take responsibility for their actions. But as adults, we should always shoulder the greater burden. We've imposed absurd rules on our young people, right down to deciding who they can play with at playtime and whether or not they're allowed to get changed for PE. But we've not seen that much action to urge adults to take responsibility for their own COVID risk, for example, by losing weight or exercising, something which would have had a far greater impact on our rates of hospitalisation and death. I certainly will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does she recognise that the government, in some of the approach in terms of lockdown, is actually creating some of the problems it believes makes the situation worse? So Weight Watchers, other organisations have said that people coming to them now have put on about 6 to 8 pounds more in weight on average, and therefore physically they're actually more vulnerable now to COVID and other health problems than they were before the pandemic.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I'm sure we can all empathise with some lockdown pounds that have been put on. And a study last week, I think it was, showed that in countries where over 50% of the adult population is overweight, have experienced 10 times the death rate. And so actually a really effective way of reducing our risk in future would be to divert some of the money we're spending on testing asymptomatic people into drives against obesity and for exercise. And that is an excellent point. But even now, as adults, we are able to move freely from home to work, to Parliament, to pub, with no restrictions. Yet children are still subject to asymptomatic testing, many are being forced to wear masks in school, and are missing out on important opportunities. We cannot expect our children to face greater restrictions than we ourselves are willing to bear. As a mother, I have despaired as I have watched the impact of these restrictions on my children and others. The stories I've heard from constituents, particularly parents of disabled children and those with additional needs, are horrifying. Millions of families have had to endure this, and I want to pay tribute to Us for Them, who are working tirelessly to stand up for children and campaign for their lives to be allowed to return to normal. But what has saddened me most is the negative attitude to children that seems to have pervaded so much of our public discourse, especially the view that teenagers have behaved irresponsibly throughout the pandemic. This view is just not borne out by evidence. A study by King's College shows that despite half of adults saying that young people have been selfish by ignoring restrictions, all age groups have been remarkably compliant, and perceptions of selfishness are driven by fake stereotypes. Madam Chairman, we seem to have forgotten what it means to be a child. We have forgotten that playing with other children, taking risks, feeling valued, and enjoying physical contact with others are vital to healthy development. As a society, I fear we're becoming a bit like Grandma from Roald Dahl's George's Marvellous Medicine. "You know what's the matter with you?" the old woman said, staring at George over the rim of the teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. "You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy." "But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma," George said. "Of course you can," she snapped. "Growing is a nasty, childish habit." Things did not end well for Grandma. And things do not bode well for us if we fail to understand the nature and the importance of childhood. Children are not disease spreaders, they're not a buffer for our healthcare system, and they're not an economic inconvenience. They are a blessing, they are our hope for the future, and their nurture and their welfare should be our primary responsibility. I'm heartened by the care that has so far been taken by the JCVI, the CMO and ministers to reassure children and parents about the decision to vaccinate our young people. But looking forward, we must recommit to putting the genuine and long-term interests of our youngest and most vulnerable citizens at the front and centre of policy making and prioritise their welfare as we recover from the pandemic.
This House has considered the vaccination of children against COVID-19. Carl McCartney.
Thank you. It would be a great pleasure. In fact, indeed, deep great pleasure to speak, Dame Eagle, under your chairmanship of this committee. Then I compliment my colleague and honourable member for Penistone and Stockbridge on securing the debate. Many of us, when we come to put a speech together, think of different ways and processes. Some use the rule of three when they put a speech together, and I want to refer to three words today that I hope the Minister and her colleagues in government take notice of. Do no harm. Regardless of the Chief Medical Officer's overruling of the JCVI, I would say when it comes to our nation's children and our young people, those in those roles should remember that their actions should do no harm. Our colleagues in government, whether newly appointed or not, should also be mindful in respect to the electorate's children, that they should do no harm. The new Minister will be aware of the strength of feeling displayed to her predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Stratford-upon-Avon, and the government in the COVID passport urgent question recently. It is again a fallacy that such direction that this government wishes to take will protect our children, and especially as 50 to 70% of those are already likely to have had contracted and survived COVID-19, according to the ONS. And so, are we really showing that we are doing no harm? And any vaccination programme, we are told, would not negate potential future school closures. So what is the point? Where is the political backbone? Is the government plan that any future upsurge in 12 to 15 cases could be perhaps ascribed to an epsilon, a zeta, perhaps an eta or a theta variant? Will anyone give an iota of credence to such an occurrence after what we have seen with hospital transference to care homes and our older generation, the subsequent surge in cases and the recent vaccination and Delta variant that has emerged? We should be mindful as politicians on all sides of this House, and I do note at this point that there are not even three opposition spokes or representative spokesmen on the other side, but I do see that the opposition spokesman is in her place. We need to do no harm for a myriad, if not a veritable plethora of reasons. I now turn my attention to the so-called Gillig Principle. As no trials have been made public that are definitive, I fail to see how any child below 16 can be fully informed. And to be fully informed, one would say that their teachers and head teachers cannot be either about the safety or otherwise of these vaccines, particularly in light of the heart impacts on young males and the reported effects in over 35,000 females of reproductive age reported in the UK national media this very last weekend. Can the CMOs and the JCVI really hold themselves, after their recent decision-making process, to the maxim that they will do no harm? Also, vaccine passports are not a first line of defence against a potential so-called winter wave of coronavirus, as Downing Street spokesmen are reported to have said. And our children of 12 to 15 years are not, like their older siblings and other under-25s who frequent nightclubs, bars and restaurants, to be used perhaps as a second line of defence either. Yeah. I urge the Minister to remember, and her colleagues in government to remember, to do no harm. There is no medium or long-term study data. I admire Chris Whitty and his colleagues for many things that they have done in the last 18 months. However, attempting to cite educational disruption or the fear of more of it for justification for the child vaccination against the JCVI advice seems a little bit desperate as far as I'm concerned. We were told that that all those at risk needed to be vaccinated. They have been. Many others have caught and survived COVID-19. So what real justification is, or is there now to vaccinate those under 40 at all, perhaps some would say? Because we've had various millions of vaccinations. How many of those under 40 with underlying health, without any underlying health issues, have died or have been hospitalised purely because of COVID-19? So why are our children still taking tests, as we've heard being referred to already, after a whole summer of not doing so? Is it because perhaps that there are thousands, if perhaps not millions, of these tests sitting in warehouses? What sort of reason is that to impose this regime on them? Are we really ensuring that we are doing no harm? Are the zealots in the civil service, the NHS and government going to stigmatise and demonise any parent who expresses concern about ensuring vaccination of our young children through fear and perhaps lies again? To take a vaccine that has had no long-term testing does not stop you getting the virus and does not stop you passing on the virus. Do no harm starts to have a very hollow ring to it. If COVID risk for young people is much, much lower, perhaps there are heart risks for males as a real concern, and reproductive females are suffering side effects, how does the Minister square that circle that we should do no harm to our young of the UK, the next generation, who will be paying for this government's and Minister's decisions for many, many years, and I fear perhaps in more ways than one? Thank you.
For bringing this forward, and we had a discussion beforehand, a talk about what her ideas were for the thrust of this debate, and I have to say that my ideas would concur with hers and what she's put forward. I just want to make a comment with that. Good to see the Minister in her place. I wish her well in the new role that she takes on, and look very much forward to working with her in the issues which we will find we have an interest in, and also very pleased, Dame Angela, to see the Shadow Minister in her place. She and I both have many things in common, but one of those is Leicester City Football Club. So we maybe not doing this well at the moment as we perhaps could do, but we look forward to better days for the future. My boys are growing up, and it's now at the grandparent stage, so I'm very pleased to I know I don't have much role to play in the childminding that my wife does. I understand that she started childminding this morning at 5 a.m, which was an early slot because both the two boys' parents are working, one working at 5 and one coming back at 8 a.m. But what I do say is this here, and I know government has always been of the opinion that the families are very core and central to society, and that's what I would like to see as well, and want to see that happening. My grandchildren, the two biggest girls, have isolated, I think, on 2 to 3 occasions. I'm glad to say they never had the COVID, but nonetheless, it's a system. If someone in the class takes it in, the whole class is out. And really, I think the Honourable Lady referred to it. I would also concur with that there. We need to have a better system where we don't have to necessarily go to those lengths every time. I am vaccinated, Dame Angela. I'm very pleased to be so, and I believe in the effectiveness of the vaccine. But I also believe in reasoned parental consent. So I believe that parents have a right to determine the best course of action in coordination with the medical staff and best practice. I've asked questions in this on a number of occasions to the Vaccine Minister last week and the week before in the Chamber. And I know I respect him greatly, and I know that he is very good at his job and is committed to that. But I wasn't really totally convinced of the answers that he gave, and I say that very respectfully because I just wasn't sure that the final decision would always lie with the parents when it comes to the. Now, I'm also encouraged by the news this morning, which refers to 89.1% have double jobs and 81.3% have single jobs. So we are moving in the right direction. So there's good news in the vaccine front. The medical evidence is by no way empirical at this stage, yet the strong suggestions are, and I quote, "New scientific advice does not endorse universal vaccination of all children over 12 in the UK." So if the scientists are saying that, we can't ignore it. The latest advice recommends that the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine should be offered to a wider number of children directly at risk from COVID-19 and to children living with an immunosuppressed person. There is very good evidence that children who have COVID-19 are much less likely to develop severe symptoms and much less likely to die from the disease than adults. While rare in children, serious outcomes from COVID-19 have been studied in this group, and the strongest risk factor is having some underlying health problems, including neurological and cardiac conditions or complex neuro disabilities. The Honourable Lady referred to those with disabilities. My honourable friend, the member for Belfast East, just 10 days ago, his son Ruben came home from school. Out of that class of 28 students, 28 young children there were, 26 of those 28 had COVID. It was actually quite now they had to self-isolate because the honourable member for Belfast East has asthma, and it can be, in his case, it was quite serious for him. But I just wonder sometimes, while we have to do things, there must genuinely be a better way. It's not the Minister's responsibility to respond for education, but I would be really keen to find out what discussions she's had with the Education Minister in relation to this issue and how better we can handle it, because I think that's what I would like to see as well. My PPS has 2 children. One comes home from school where they have to isolate because someone in the class has got COVID. They haven't. They bring it into the house. I can't understand why they can't go back to school. She can't understand it either. You have to isolate from the classroom, but yet no, you can interact with your other sister who's in a different class at school and with the family. So I think we really need to have a better way of looking at these things. It's my opinion that while some parents under medical advice may decide that the jab is a safer option, the standing point must be that it's not a matter of opt-out, but rather opt-in. I read incredibly interesting data from Israel, which suggests immunity gained after recovering from a bout of COVID-19 is more protective against a new Delta variant than vaccine-induced immunity. Natural immunity was estimated to be about 13 times stronger than having 2 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So the importance, I believe, Angela, of the natural immunity, it should be key to how we deal with this. When we add this, the fact that our own data shows that children do not tend to become seriously ill underlines to me the importance of government allowing parents to determine. And when saying this, I mean that there must not be any pressure applied by secondary schools or any school, such as restriction to after-school sports clubs, etc., without vaccination proof. Again, a child needs a normal life. The Honourable Lady referred to the impact upon children's mental health, and I know that the figures I have for Northern Ireland, Dame Angela, would show that the effect of mental health, even at children at primary school levels, is greater than it's ever been. So you need that social interaction. That's why I'm very pleased to be back in Parliament and to have the social interaction with people once again, because that's the way it should be. But it's also important for children at school. We have to address the obesity issue, which you also referred to, and I think it's important to put that into perspective. Physical health at school, physical health at home, the role of parents in that there is critical. Sometimes we go overboard on restrictions. and perhaps not always necessary, Dame Angela. I do believe that we do need to be aware of how COVID safety should be carried out and have normal life. Protect children, but yet make parental input central and critical. I finish with this comment, Dame Angela. I will say again, I believe in the vaccine. I totally am committed to what it has done. It's given us a leadership in the world for our vaccination programme, which I thank the Minister, thank Government for the leadership. I believe it has helped. Happy to, yes. Yeah.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way there, Manager. I just wanted to say I picked up on his comments earlier on about being sociable and being back in this place, and I didn't want him to sit down having made a speech without being intervened on, as he's probably one of the most sociable ones of our members from right across the floor of the House. So well done, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. I think we've had a friendship and a relationship, and we've been in the same corridor, not across from each other in our offices, so that friendship goes back. So I'm very pleased to renew that friendship again in this House. I believe that we have seen a decline due to the vaccine, and the benefits are clear to see. However, the tale from a child's eyes is very different, and parental consent, hand in hand with medical guidance in specific cases, must be the way in which we move forward. I believe that is what we should be doing. I am very pleased to have had this debate. I thank the Honourable Lady again for that. I look forward to other contributions, as I know they will probably, hopefully, endorse what we've all said. Thank you.
Greg Smith. Are you not standing? Chris Green.
Thank you, Dame Angela. It's a pleasure to follow Right Honourable Gentleman for Strangford, who made so many important points, and especially I appreciate and thank my honourable friend for Penistone and Stocksbridge for leading on this debate, which I know so many people right across the country are grateful for, because this is an immense area of concern as their children are being vaccinated or not vaccinated, as the case may be, as the country has gone through such a difficult time over such a long period of time. March last year, who would have thought in March last year we'd be in this position debating whether 12-year-olds would be vaccinated to deal with this disease? So at the beginning, there was very little certainty, scientific understanding of what we were facing. The scientific understanding has carried on apace. There's been a huge global effort in that understanding. And on the medical side, there's been a huge advance in the way we treat people. COVID is far less dangerous now than it was at the beginning. And I think we need to be very clear of this, and including when we look at the government statistics on how the deaths and other concerns are presented, still to this day having the overall death rate, including those deaths right at the beginning or the deaths in the first and second wave, still as part of our understanding today, it makes us believe that we haven't rolled out an effective vaccines program. It makes us believe that doctors and people in hospitals aren't far more effective at treating the disease itself. We're in a far better position, and that needs to be more clearly understood. And at the beginning, the vaccine rollout was understood. January earlier this year, December last year, the vaccine programme was being pitched as to treat and protect the most vulnerable, those who are old, those who have particular challenges with health. And then before we knew it, the ages were coming down and down and down. And then we got to the age of 18, and at the same time, it was not your single vaccination, it was your double vaccination, which would give you the necessary protection. And now we're in the position of a booster vaccination for people in the very near future. Initially, it's been proposed for 50-year-olds plus, but will that come down as well? And we, therefore, what I'm pointing out here is that we haven't been given any certainty over what the government, what the advisors deem to be a success. And it seems as though the system, because it's not been given clarity over what success is, the system carries on and on and on. The next group, the next group, the next group receive the vaccination. But we know on the first and second wave the connection between transmission, hospitalisation and death was strong. We know on the third wave from the government data that the connection between transmission leading to hospitalisation and death is fundamentally broken. It's nothing compared to what it was at the beginning. And our approach, therefore, to COVID ought to reflect those facts. I'll give way.
I recall the pervasive disapproval that attached to my family when my children were at school, when it became apparent that my wife was refusing to use the chemical solution, the powerful chemical solution, for the control of nits. Now, when we come to schools being collectively vaccinated, the decision of some parents or children not to be vaccinated will undoubtedly be a matter of common knowledge, or there's certainly the danger of that. Does my honourable friend share my concern that it will be difficult to prevent that general disapproval and all that may flow from it being attached to parents or children that have decided not to be vaccinated?
I think my honourable friend makes exactly the right point. In the school setting, it's going to be incredibly difficult to do this, and it's going to be very variable, depending upon the culture within that school, depending upon the school leadership. Some schools will be very open and objective. We will respect you, the family, for the decisions you make on behalf of your family. Other schools, I fear, and I'm pretty certain, they will have a very difficult and challenging atmosphere for those 12-year-old children and for those families if they don't comply. And I think this is a very dangerous route for us to go down, where we can have so much pressure, and it actually leads on to an immensely important point. Traditionally, in the United Kingdom, we've had an approach of non-compulsion of vaccinations. Our vaccination take-up across the board has been very high because people trust in the vaccination programme. They trust that these things we can take on a voluntary basis are there for our own good. We don't need coercion to take them. They're there for our good, so we will take them. And what is the repercussions we're going to face in years to come now that there is a toxification due to the imposition of these vaccines? And what, furthermore, do we see? We see the first and second wave having a huge impact on us. We see the third wave being far less impactful. All of our vaccines are effective against all variants of concern. And at this time, we see compulsory vaccination in the care sector, no doubt shortly to be rolled out into the National Health Service, and therefore, after that, to other sectors in society. We see the establishment of the principle and the ideas of vaccine IDs, domestic ID cards. There's a pause at the moment in England, but we can see in Scotland and in Wales these causes are being advanced. So in many ways, we can objectively say we are almost through the worst of the pandemic, and yet the more draconian or authoritarian measures are being introduced at this stage. It's perverse. I'll give way.
Thank you. My friend is making an excellent speech. And on the issue of trust in vaccinations, I think he makes a very, very good point, because we have an outstanding system of child vaccinations in this country with very high uptake and no compulsion at all. And that's predicated on the fact that parents know that those vaccines are without doubt in their children's best interest, because polio, measles, all these diseases are child killers, they're life-altering. You know, even if the risks are low, they're considerably higher still than the vaccine. And so the understanding, the trust, is vital. So does he agree that it's very important that concerns and that there is transparency around the concerns now, so that parents are making that free decision, and it doesn't impact on the outstanding rollout of other vaccines in future that very much are in our children's best interests and vitally need to continue for public health?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend that confidence needs to be restored in the wider vaccine programme. There needs to be a renewal of the focus, because vaccinations for infants has dipped slightly, but it has dipped. And for older children and teenagers, the wider vaccine programmes has dipped more substantially. So we have a significant catch-up programme to have in our broader vaccines programme. And we're also, I think, going to see increased concerns as drug companies now want to get the approval for the COVID vaccines reduced to the age of 5 years old. We're seeing the potential, therefore, for this undefined point at which we can declare our position as a success. If we don't have a clear understanding of what success means, will the system, will the establishment, will the government, will advisors then say, we now have approval for drugs to be applied to 5-year-olds, and that is the next step. So I'd ask my honourable friend, the Vaccines Minister, whom I welcome to the front bench. And I just ask her to clarify a couple of points. So we here and broader society and other health professionals outside the scope of government can understand what is the end point. Professor Whitty said we will at a certain point be able to treat the coronavirus as we treat influenza. What is the objective criteria by which we and others can judge that? And secondly, I've asked my honourable friend's predecessor as Vaccines Minister, what is the transition point from when we as a society understand we have moved from pandemic disease, where we need restrictions, perhaps need restrictions and other lockdown measures, we need to treat it as a pandemic, and when do we move to an endemic disease, where we treat coronavirus as we treat influenza and other diseases, many of which are incredibly dangerous to people who are vulnerable. Influenza for vulnerable people is a very dangerous disease. We need to know, when coronavirus goes from pandemic to endemic, objective criteria, because when the Vaccines Minister replied to me previously, I could define what he said as we come out of pandemic status tomorrow, or we come out in 10 years' time. And I don't think that's good enough when schools, when families need more certainty.
Just to assist people, I intend to call the front bench at 10:38. Andrew Lewis.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for chairing this debate. And I want to thank my friend, the Honourable Member for Penistone Stockbridge, in obtaining a debate on this immensely important topic and speaking so convincingly. Despite what's been said otherwise, the JCVI's recommendation on mass vaccination of children aged 12 to 15 is clear, and quote, "The margin of benefit in vaccinating healthy to 12 to 15-year-olds is too small to support such a policy." That was the conclusion reached when the question was asked, as it should be in the case of medical decisions, what would be in the best interests of our children's health? Throughout this whole pandemic, we've continually been told of the importance of following the science. So a warm welcome to my honourable friend to her ministerial position, but I would be grateful if she could explain why then we are now disregarding the science and the experts who've so clearly said that it's not necessary nor advisable on the basis of the evidence we currently have for this cohort to receive a COVID-19 vaccine. Given fake news, some people are seizing on any lack of clarity or inconsistency to be anti-vax, which I'm very much not. And that is a real risk here by government overriding in this way trust, as my honourable friend from Bolton West has delineated so well. If it's because of extraneous factors that have been mentioned in recent days, such as protecting children's mental health and ensuring they miss no further school, then it must be said of both of those problems that they have their root in government decision-making. School closures are a political choice. Testing regimes are a bureaucratic insistency from the Department for Education. The fear some children may have of dying from COVID-19 has come from a created climate of fear, because the evidence shows that both children who are perfectly healthy and those who've got some underlying health conditions face a mortality rate from COVID-19 of 2 in every million. Children are therefore not at risk of death or serious illness from COVID-19. In fact, most children are either asymptomatic or experience a mild illness. Given most vaccines don't prevent transmission, and those most at risk due to age or underlying health conditions have been double vaccinated, this recommendation is not only unnecessary, it could be dangerous. We should be protecting our children and not taking unnecessary risks with their health in favour of some vague notion of perceived benefits to wider society.
Would my honourable friend give
Yes.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does he share my concern that initially the government's perspective was we need a double vaccination, firstly to get the protection and secondly to get the longevity of protection, and yet for 12 to 15-year-olds the vaccine is intended for one dose only, therefore relatively short-term protection? That doesn't fit in, that's not consistent with the general stated aims of the vaccine programme.
Thank you. My honourable friend very capably highlights yet one other inconsistency in this. It's also important to remember that any child who gets seriously ill or, heaven forbid, dies from a vaccine does so because of a policy decision and not a disease. Turning to parental responsibility, many constituents as parents themselves have expressed their deep unease at the government's recommendation, but even more so that under the ill-advised Gillig Principles, children will be able to consent to taking this vaccine against their parents' wishes. And having Gillig cited, as it has been in these debates, it's been cited as some sort of set in stone, could never be changed, as if some sort of legal precedent, when this House exists to make law, can't somehow be overridden, as so many other things have apparently quite straightforwardly been overridden in the last year or two. The Gillette Principles, it's unfortunate that it's named after her really, given her own background, is that children will be able to consent to taking this vaccine against their parents' wishes. It's long been accepted in this country, and in the thinking of my political background and heritage particularly, that children under the age of 18, and certainly under 16, should be the responsibility of their parents, that they should be guided and protected by them, and that parents, as adults, will make decisions in the best interests of their children. And it's only in exceptional circumstances that agents of the state interfere in that relationship and override a parent's wish for their child. For their child. I'm deeply concerned, however, by the increasing trend away from this principle. In fact, just last week we saw the High Court hand down a deeply concerning judgment that children under the age of 16 will be able to consent to taking puberty blockers without the need for parental permission. We're rapidly descending a very slippery slope, and it's a mistake to allow children to circumvent parental control, especially when the long-term consequences of these vaccines are not yet clear. There's been very limited research and data collected on the efficacy and safety of these vaccines in children. I've been contacted by local teachers in my constituency in Northampton South who are receiving concerned emails from parents and accusing schools themselves of implementing this policy. I want it to be clear that this is a government proposal and that schools will have no liability in carrying out injections. And I also want clarification from the Minister that vaccines will not be administered by school staff. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Derek Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Dame Angela. I work out from your timing that I get 20 minutes to speak.
Order. The latest I will bring in the front benchers is 10:38, so you don't have to take your full 20 minutes.
I'm pretty sure I won't. Thank you very much. And can I congratulate the Minister, who was until last week my favourite whip, who now is the Vaccine Minister. So congratulations. I think it's a great honour for you to do this job, and I'm sad that we're having to come against this particular policy, because actually across the board the vaccine programme has been remarkable. And can I congratulate the member for Penistone and Stockbridge for securing this debate. It's really important. It is agitating concerning enormous numbers of people, not just parents, but also schools and many others who feel that it's a step too far. And can I just say, before I get into my speech, I am a Conservative. I joined the Conservative Party because of the belief in giving people freedom of choice, ability to deliver and develop their own destiny, for us to give them opportunity to live full and vibrant and fulfilling lives. I think this particular policy goes right against that, and I feel uncomfortable with it. I feel it feels wrong, and I believe it's wrong to be introducing this vaccination programme for children 12 to 15 with all the kind of things we said about consent this morning. And can I just finally say, before I get started, that I'm also feel privileged to be in this room where such great points and great speeches have been made, because we care about our families, our children, and how our schools are supported in a very difficult and unprecedented time. Early in the year, right at the beginning of the year, Dame Angela, I went to visit St Clair Medical Centre in my constituency, who was delivering the vaccine programme with great fervour. They had an amazing system going on. In fact, they and other primary care networks in my constituency were mentioned in dispatches by the incredible effort they put into getting the vaccine out to the most vulnerable people. In fact, my constituency was one, I think the fifth in the country for getting most people vaccinated by the February half-term. And as I observed the logistical challenge and triumph of rolling out the vaccine programme and talking to the practice manager, she described why the additional workload was acceptable, the massive volunteer army was motivated and mobilised, the incredible collaboration of all sorts of people across the GPs, the NHS, all sorts of organisations that got behind this, and the organisation across the primary care networks. She said that all of that extra effort, the long weekends, the massive work that went into it, was possible and worthwhile because they were part of the national effort. And that really struck home that actually these people, right down at the very end, the most beautiful part of the country, often tucked away and not necessarily engaged in national efforts, were so enthusiastic and determined to make this work. As I say, West Cornwall primary care networks were mentioned by the Secretary of State at the time for the incredible effort in getting vaccines to people in such a quick and effective way. During the rollout of the vaccine programme, ministers have fiercely defended the decisions made by the Joint Committee of Vaccine and Immunisation. The JVCI determined the priority groups, who would get the vaccine and when, and ministers refused to intervene, were determined that they would not intervene, even to prioritise teachers as schools opened back in September last year. They refused to intervene to prioritise the policemen when some 10,000 policemen descended on my constituency and across Cornwall for the G7. There was great concern about that, but the ministers refused to intervene to allow police officers of all ages to have the vaccine ahead of the priority group set out by the GCVI. And so why now is it that with the help of the CMO, the Chief Medical Officers, the government rejects the advice of the GCVI, which has said, and we've heard it already, the margin of benefit is too small to support advice on a universal programme of vaccination of otherwise healthy 12 to 15-year-olds. And they also say any impact on transmission may be relatively small in terms of disruption to the children's. In other words, schools would still be disruptive because of the vaccine doesn't actually really manage transmission. I, along with many others, recognise the wisdom of the advice of the JCVI in this area, and we were surprised when, just a matter of weeks later, the government and the CMO seemed to take a completely different course. I was relieved when the JCVI made their case and made this very sound advice, gave this sound advice, and then, like many other people, disappointed and concerned that the government seemed to go against it. My concern, and the reason of my concern, is that the impact of this decision to override the JVCI advice is to undermine confidence in the very vaccine rollout programme. Up until now, people, because of the way the JCVI have operated, the country has has welcomed the approach and supported it and had confidence in it. And I wonder whether the government is actually doing a disservice by potentially undermining the very confidence in this. So far, the great strength of the vaccine rollout is the voluntary nature of it, based on sound advice and a national united effort. My fear is that the decision, for seemingly unsubstantiated reasons, there are gaping holes in the argument that it will minimise disruption of children's education. My fear is that it risks turning a national effort into a tool to pressure children, undermine parents and drive an inadvertent wedge between families and schools. And under a new Secretary of State, the government's primary priority should be to allow schools to do what they do best, which is to educate children. Also, to carry an interest, I've got 3 in school at this very moment, I'm hoping. Can I just briefly, at the beginning of this year, Madam Chairman, Dame Angela, at the beginning of this year I secured a German debate on the experience of schools. They have had a blimmin' rotten time. The changing advice, all sorts of things coming down to them from government that they just didn't know if they were coming or going. And what's really concerned schools heads and school teachers is that they've taken on this new role of trying to manage the health of children, trying to manage parts of a child's welfare, which actually they never signed up to. It's not that they're unwilling, but they just haven't got the time, resources, and maybe they would even say the expertise to take on all these additional responsibilities when actually they just want to educate our children and give them the very best start in life. And what we've had, and we as all MPs with constituency offices have been managing and supporting schools in this bizarre work they've had to do to manage parents on different sides of different arguments when it comes to managing COVID within the school. I've had parents who are furious with the school for insisting on face coverings in parts of the school before that was the official advice and since. I've had other parents furious at the school for saying they don't have to wear their face covering in the classroom. And so the poor head teachers and staff had to deal with this amongst all the pressure of teaching children. And so what do? We turn around and make their job a whole lot more difficult by actually putting schools in the centre of a decision that actually we don't believe, here, most of us in this room, that is robust, stands up to what scientists have said. And we've asked them to take on this additional responsibility and manage the various pressures that come with it to vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds, when actually all they want to do, and they thought they were doing, was to go back to school in September and just get on with catching up and giving their children a happy, healthy and wonderful experience, been educated. I really feel for our children, certainly, yeah.
Does he agree that when it comes to policies, you've referred to one school where there's different opinions with parents and their children. There's also different opinions in relation to schools, but there's an importance to have a policy that's uniform across all schools. Does he feel that when the Minister applies, perhaps maybe the discussions with the Education Minister to have a conform policy that applies to all schools, and then they've got a rule they can all adhere to?
I was going to thank you for that intervention, because I was going to come on to that, because we are entering into a very difficult situation now where we need to protect the schools and enable them to do their job and not to drive this wedge between parents and schools. But at the same time, we want schools to be very clear about what their responsibilities are and how they can manage issues of coercion and all sorts, and peer pressure, and etc. So it's a really tricky one that the Minister has got to grapple with. So you're absolutely right to raise that. As I do come to the end of my speech, Dame Angela, there are 3 things I'd like the Minister to ensure and to really confirm, and I would imagine it will be the vast majority of her work in the next few weeks, as the government has made this decision, which obviously many of us would rather they just ditched and gave the vaccine, made sure the vaccine actually got to people in the third world, developing countries who really need it. And if we really care about keeping this country safe and the rest of the Western world, if that's our priority, then actually to support the vaccination of the whole world is the answer, not our children. But that's a separate one that the Vaccine Minister probably can't address on her own. But can the Minister, in line with the intervention I've just received, can the Minister make absolutely clear that parents have the information that they need? They understand what their rights are, they're very clear, about what the role of the school is in relation to providing the vaccine and supporting children to have the vaccine if that's what they wish for their children. But can we also ensure that the vaccine is only given when informed and voluntary consent is given, is very clear, definitely there, and free from peer pressure and coercion? We have entered into a place now where we are asking schools to somehow play referee over a situation which should never be in their school environments. And you'll have a situation where, because of the desire to get on top of COVID and get things going again, actually things could go wrong and situations could become very difficult in the school environment. Certainly, yeah.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I'm sorry to interrupt right at the end of his speech, but he just asked the Minister a few questions. I just wondered if he knew, or perhaps if the Minister might refer in her remarks, to the strength of any vaccination that might be given to children under the age of 16.
I'm not even going to attempt to answer that, other than to say the point made earlier about the fact that it's a single dose is a very interesting point, because it's a single dose. Where next? Is it boosters of a single dose in time, or is this some curious thing that somehow we just want to get the whole country vaccinated and then we'll just wonder what to do next after Christmas? But it's a good point, and I hope the Minister deals with it. So can we be absolutely clear that parents are very clear that they know what the situation is for them, what their rights are, and that they are supported as parents to raise their children to know what's right for their children? Can we also absolutely ensure that the vaccine is never used and cannot be used as a condition of access to education for whoever, whether it's in special schools or even children in care, whatever the situation is, that there is no opportunity for education to be a condition of someone having the vaccine, or rather the vaccine being a condition of education? And can we also not give up, and I don't think for a minute that that's the intention, but the Joint Committee on Vaccine Immunisation has done a fantastic job and has led the nation in this rollout and has made us one of the most successful countries in the world in relation to it. Can we allow them the freedom to monitor how this rollout goes forward in this particular area with children, to actually continue to advise, and if they then come and say that the benefits of this, the margins are still too small, that the government properly review this and be bold enough to stop it if that is the advice that's given. We need to ensure that the public can continue to trust the advice and the vaccine programme as it is today. And finally, in conclusion, the systematic testing, when is that going to come to an end? It's costing a fortune. It's bizarre to test healthy children, and it certainly isn't, I believe, the right thing to be continuing to do. And how can we ensure that we don't just protect the UK public, but those around the world? And what is the next step? Our policy is to give one jab to 12 to 15-year-olds. What is in the thinking of the government and scientists about what is the next step for making sure, or in their view, making sure our children continue going to school? Please can we get back to just giving vaccines because of that individual's health, not to protect the school environment, the community, or even, dare I say it, the economy. Thank you, Dame Angela.
Shadow Minister Liz Kendall.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Dame Angela, and I welcome this timely and important debate secured by the Honourable Member for Penistone and Stocksbridge. I and my Labour colleagues strongly welcome the fact that children aged between 12 to 15 are now being offered their first dose of a COVID vaccine, following advice from all 4 of the UK's CMOs, something we have been calling for since June. This will have both direct and indirect health benefits for children. It will help keep them in school, which is vital after all the face-to-face learning they've missed out on, and the impact this could have on their longer life chances. And vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds will also help their families and the wider community by helping to keep infection rates down. The latest figures show there were 36,000 new infections in the last 24 hours. There are 7,847 people in hospital with COVID-19, and the average number of daily deaths over the last week has risen to a tragic 142. And in my own city of Leicester, Dame Angela, rates remain highest amongst 11 to 16-year-olds, with a considerable increase over the last month. So there is not a moment to waste. Now, we've been calling on the government to press ahead with a vaccination programme for children since the start of the summer. Back in June, my right honourable friend, the Shadow Minister for Schools and member for Hove, argued that if COVID vaccinations for children are found to be safe, which the MHRA clearly says they are, then they should be rolled out over the summer holidays before the beginning of the new academic year to help keep disruption in schools to a minimum. In July, my honourable friend, the Shadow Health Secretary and member for Leicester South, pressed the Health Secretary on why COVID-19 vaccinations were being given to children in the United States, Canada, Israel, France, Austria, Spain and Hong Kong, but not here in the UK. But I'm sad to say the government at that stage failed to act. And whilst we are rightly proud of the amazing vaccination programme delivered by our NHS, the truth is we are now being overtaken by other countries, and that is in no small part due to the vaccination of children. France, if you just let me make this point and then I will give way. France was one of the first to offer vaccines to children back in June, and now 68% of children aged 12 to 18 have received a single dose. In Italy, it's 62%. In Spain, 79%. Israel, the US, Canada, Sweden, Poland, Switzerland have also raced ahead. So whilst our government spent months delaying on this vital issue, countries across the world acted and now are streets ahead of us in protecting children, their education and the wider community. So it's now vital we catch up. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Honourable Member and for the important point she's making in her speech. Does she believe that it is important to have to follow what other countries are doing and to kind of roll out the vaccine on the basis of almost an international competition? Or is it actually more important to be safe? And also, does she not think that the fact that we were in advance of many other countries and broke that link between case rates and deaths early on should actually give us more space to breathe and take longer to make the decisions when it comes to much more finely balanced decisions around vaccinating children?
I'm sure the Honourable Lady isn't suggesting that all of those other countries have made a decision not based on the evidence, because that would be insulting to those countries. I believe that we should, and I'll come on to say more about this, base our decisions on evidence and advice from the experts. That's what's happened in other countries. I just wished we'd done it earlier in this country.
To respond to that point.
I will, of course, allow her to come back on that.
Thank you, and she's absolutely right. I'm not saying at all that other countries aren't basing that on their own evidence. What I'm saying is that the success of our programme was based on the JCVI's advice, their particular method of offering vaccination based on individual medical benefit. That gave us an incredible advantage, which could have allowed us to wait a further 6 months, 9 months to make this decision.
I'm glad she's raised this point. Sorry. Okay.
Ms. Kendall.
Thank you, Dame Angela. I'm actually going to come back to this point because several honourable members have talked about what the JCVI recommended, and I hope I'll be able to put a little bit more information around what they actually said a little bit later in this debate. Now, before I go on to talk about the evidence, if the honourable gentleman will forgive me, I want to make sure that there's time for the Minister and for the Honourable Lady who secured this debate to come back. I want to make some really important points about the evidence, but may I first say something about some deeply concerning and troubling incidents in my own Leicester West constituency. I am appalled that some of our head teachers have received threats via letters and on social media, including threats of legal action and even death threats, accusing the heads of supposedly promoting illegal medical experimentation on children. This is disgraceful and completely unacceptable. And as the head teacher of New College in my constituency, Jane Brown, says, We need to call this out. Schools are having a tough enough time as it is, and without being bullied too. And I hope when the Minister, who I welcome to her place, when she rises to speak, will join me in condemning these threats and intimidation, in once again making it clear vaccination will be voluntary, that no child will have the vaccine forced upon them, and that it is also vital to stress that schools are the venue for the vaccination, but firstly, the delivery of the programme will be done by the NHS, and that secondly, arrangements for consent for this vaccination will be exactly the same as they are for all other vaccinations and for all other medical procedures as they have been over past decades. And I hope she will say what the government will do to try and deal with these threats and intimidation, which I fear are growing. Now, let me turn now to say more about why I and my Labour colleagues so strongly welcome the CMO's decision. As always, we are guided on the evidence and on the advice from the experts. This shows, first, COVID vaccines for children are safe and effective to use, with the benefits exceeding the risks on an individual basis. This is the view of the MHRA and the equivalent regulators in Europe, the USA and Canada. The JCVI agrees that the benefits of vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds exceed the risks. In other words, that it is better to be vaccinated than not in this age group. In their decision to recommend universal vaccination of 12 to 15-year-olds, the 4 CMOs took as read the JCVI and MHRA view that the benefits exceeded the risks. They then looked at the wider benefits, and it is not true to say that the JCVI advice has been undermined, as I have heard several times in this debate. The JCVI says, and I quote, "It is not within our remit to incorporate in-depth considerations on wider societal impacts, including educational benefits. The government may wish to seek further views on the wider societal and educational impacts from the CMO, the Chief Medical Officers of the 4 nations, with representation from JCVI in these subsequent discussions." They recommended the wider societal impacts were looked at. That is not undermining the JCVI's decision, it is putting it into practice. And in doing this, the CMOs consulted with a wide range of organisations, including the Royal College of GPs, of Psychiatry, of Paediatrics and Child Health, the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, the Faculty of Public Health, and many others. Now, the CMOs, in making their decision, said the most important issue in this age group was the impact on education, which is vital in itself and as one of the most important drivers of public health and mental health. The CMOs note that, and I quote, "The impact has been especially great in areas of relative deprivation, which have been particularly badly affected by COVID-19. Areas of the country precisely like the ones that I represent in Leicester West, who are in lockdown far longer than any other part of the country. Children have lost out, on average, of 115 days of class learning. This could have a huge impact on their later life chances, not to mention the knock-on impact on their ability to fulfil their potential, earn, and all the impact that has on the wider economy. But the CMOs also rightly say there are health ramifications of missing out on schooling, as educational attainment is a key determinant of a person's health throughout their life. It has an impact on their wider social mobility, on their future likelihood of comorbidities. It can help, it affects obesity, smoking, alcoholism, and longer life expectancy, not to mention the widely recognised mental health benefits of education in both the long and short term. Children cannot afford to miss out on any more face-to-face learning for their educational opportunities and their wider impact. As the CMOs said, and I quote, "The additional likely benefits of reducing educational disruption and the consequent reduction in public health harm from educational disruption, on balance, provide sufficient extra advantage in addition to the marginal advantage at the individual level identified by the JCVI." This is not undermining the JCVI's advice. it is putting it into practice. And the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health agrees. They say, we believe that vaccination could benefit healthy children irrespective of any direct health benefit in enabling them to have less interruption to school attendance, allowing them to mix more freely with their friends and helping reduce the anxiety some children feel about COVID-19. We need to move swiftly on this. We need to strain every sinew to get children vaccinated, to help them, help their families and help the wider community. I hope when the Minister rises, she will say what more the government is doing to encourage this and, critically, to make sure the appalling threats to our schools are effectively dealt with. And I look forward to hearing her response. No.
I call the Minister, Maggie Throop.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Penistone and Stocksbridge for calling this important and timely debate on the vaccination of 12 to 15-year-olds against COVID-19, and quite rightly highlighted the importance of vaccine rollouts and the programmes that we've had over many decades, and I thank her for that. And before I respond to the various questions and points raised by honourable members, I would like to pay tribute to my predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Stratford-on-Avon, for his efforts in successfully delivering the vaccines programme with more than 93 million doses administered in the UK and more than 4/5 of adults receiving the protection of 2 jabs, and I aim to build on that very solid foundation in my new role. I would also like to put on record that I am very grateful to everyone who has played a crucial role in the success of the vaccine rollout, from our brilliant scientists, clinical trial participants, the armed forces, NHS England, frontline healthcare workers, vaccine volunteers, as well as local and central government. Our jabs have already prevented over 112,000 deaths and more than 230,000 hospitalisations and over 24 million infections. They have built a vast wall of defence for the British people. Early this year, our medicines regulator, the MHRA, approved the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine for 12 to 17-year-olds. The MHRA authorisation decision confirmed that both vaccines are safe and effective for this age group. Upon this decision, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation recommended vaccination for 12 to 15-year-olds with serious underlying health conditions. In August, the committee advised an initial dose of the vaccine for all healthy remaining 16 and 17-year-olds. The JCVI then looked at whether we should extend our offer of vaccination to all 12 to 15-year-olds. They concluded that there are health benefits of vaccinating this cohort, although they are finely balanced. However, the JCVI's remit does not include the wider impacts of vaccinations, such as the benefits for children in education or the mental health benefits that come from people knowing that they are protected from this deadly virus. They therefore advised that the government may wish to seek further views on those wider impacts from the government's chief medical officers. From the UK's chief medical officers across all 4 nations. The Secretary of State, together with the health ministers from the devolved nations, accepted that advice. Our CMOs consulted with clinical experts and public health professionals from across the United Kingdom, such as the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. And I trust that this reassures my honourable friend for Northampton South, who raised his concerns about professional advice. We received advice from the 4 chief medical officers, which were made publicly available and deposited in the library for members to be able to read in full. The unanimous recommendation of the UK's chief medical officers is to offer all remaining 12 to 15-year-olds a first dose of the Pfizer vaccine, with further JCVI guidance needed before any decision on a second dose. They have been clear that they are making this recommendation based on the benefits to children alone and not on the benefits to adults or wider society. I can confirm that the government accepted this recommendation. We are now moving forward with the same sense of urgency that we had previously had at every point in our vaccination programme. I'm delighted that a 14-year-old in Essex yesterday became one of the first children in the country to receive a COVID-19 vaccination in school.
would she set out exactly why for adults it's recommended to have 2 doses and perhaps later on have a booster dose of the vaccine, but for children it's a single dose?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I would like to reassure him that the evidence is continually being observed and recorded, and further advice will be taken on whether a second dose is needed for the younger age range. It's still, evidence is being gathered all the time. And if I may continue, I appreciate there are questions about how the process of consent will work, and these circumstances where parents and children disagree. I would like to reassure my honourable friend from St Ives that, as with all vaccinations for children, parental consent will be sought. The consent process is being handled by each school in their usual way and will provide sufficient for parents to provide their consent. Children aged 12 to 15 will also be provided with information, usually in the form of a leaflet for their own use, and to share and discuss with parents prior to the date that the immunisation is scheduled. Parental, guardian or carer consent will be sought by the school-age immunisation services prior to vaccination, and that's in line with other school vaccination programmes. It is this service that will be carrying out the vaccines, which I trust reassures my honourable friend from Northampton South. The school-age vaccination service has vast experience in dealing with a number of other school vaccine rollouts in secondary schools, such as the HPV vaccine, the 3-in-1 teenage booster which protects against tetanus, diphtheria and polio. Those clinicians who work on these rollouts are very well equipped and very well versed in dealing with vaccines in school. In their advice, the 4 CMOs have said it is essential that children and young people aged 12 to 15 and their parents are supported in their decisions, whatever decisions they take, and are not stigmatised either for accepting or not accepting the vaccination offer. Individual choice should be respected. It is the opportunity to be vaccinated that is on offer and in a fair and equitable manner. And I completely understand that those who remain decided, I want to say this. The MHRA is the best medical regulator in the world. It has rigorously reviewed the safety of our vaccines and only authorises those it concludes are safe. Vaccines for children and young people are no exception to this. We continue to have a comprehensive safety surveillance strategy in place across all age groups to monitor the safety of all the COVID-19 vaccines that are approved for use in the United Kingdom. I'd now like to address some of the interventions and questions from my other honourable members. And my honourable friend for Penistone and Stocksbridge asked a number of questions. And I'd like to reiterate that the CMO sought advice from experts in the field. It wasn't just the information they had themselves. It is only right that based on the advice of the CMOs that the 12 to 15-year-olds are able to take up the offer of the vaccine in a fair and equitable manner. I know that she asked a number of other questions, and I think one question that my honourable friend asked was about the disruption to education of the programme. I know that the NHS England have already got plans in place for the mop-up programme that are not likely to be on school sites, to minimise disruption and also to ensure there's no disruption to the rest of the immunisation programme. I will give way.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I very much appreciate the points and the reassurance that the Minister is given. But even the CMO acknowledged that the vaccine programme in itself is not going to end disruption to schools, and that whether or not people choose to have this vaccine, which absolutely should be a free decision, as she says, what is more important is the policy making around having consistent rules in schools, as the Honourable Member for Strangford said, but also ending the mass asymptomatic testing, which is picking up cases it doesn't need to pick up and is in itself causing the disruption. So how will the disruption to school end, even if vaccination does go ahead and cover a wide population?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. I think it's important that we do whatever we can, whatever in our toolbox, to make sure that children are able to continue with their education. And this is one part of to reassure the continuation of their education, which I know she's passionate about this, and I am about making sure children get full education and the pandemic doesn't affect their future. I know she raised a number of other questions, and if she'll allow me, any questions I haven't answered during my speech, I'll write to her with the answers. There was, my honourable friends raised questions about guidance for schools on the vaccination programme, and this has been set out very clearly on how the programme will work, and including in the formation of the consent process, which has been published and it was recently updated on the 17th of September. I'd like to reassure my honourable friend from Lincoln, who highlighted the 3 words, do no harm, that robust monitoring arrangements are in place for the vaccination of 12 to 15-year-olds, and the further data will be available shortly. And I would obviously like to join the honourable lady who speaks for the opposition and absolutely condemn the threats and intimidation to head teachers, school staff and anybody who enters school premises. And I feel that this is a very big issue, and my advice is that head teachers who have received such intimidation should very rapidly contact the Schools Age Immunisation Service, who are well versed in addressing this issue, and not be afraid to speak to the police and the local authority as well. I would like to reassure her that this issue is extremely high on my priority list, which, as you can imagine, will be getting longer. Madam Chair, in closing, I think it's important that we remember that our teenagers have shown great public spirit in every point during the pandemic, and I thank them for this. They have stuck to the rules that lives could be saved and people kept safe, and they have been some of the most enthusiastic proponents of vaccines. I will give you one final time.
With the certain drugs companies are now looking to get approval for vaccinations for 5-year-olds. Does my honourable friend rule that in or rule that out for the future in the United Kingdom?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and my focus at the moment is to ensure that we get the effective rollout of the 12 to 15-year-old programme, that we ensure that the booster programme is rolled out effectively, and those last few, well, I think it's about 5 million people who haven't yet had the vaccine are encouraged to take up that offer. I'll give way one final time.
I do thank you, Chair, and I'm conscious that there are a few minutes left in this debate, which it is, and I would make reference to 3 more quick things, if I may. Firstly, you may well have noticed, sorry, Chairman, the Minister may well have noticed that the first speech in support of the Government's position has come from the opposition, who have claimed to be speaking on behalf of all their MPs, although there only seems to be one here. Secondly, there was a point made about about that member's own seat and the number of young people who have, I believe, COVID, although she didn't refer to the actual, the member didn't refer to the actual number, the statistic that was being referred to. However, if school children have not been tested over the summer, surely now they are being tested in school, the incidence of those with COVID will be rising. And therefore, I'm being very gracious to both the front bench spokesmen in the fact that they probably... It is, but I'm coming to the end of my comments, Chair. I'm conscious of that. The time when I was growing up, there was a very famous pop song which said, "Don't believe the hype." Surely that's something that we should all be taking notice of.
Minister.
I take my honourable friend's comments on board, but I would like to inform the House that more than half of 16 and 17-year-olds across the United Kingdom have had the jab, despite most only having become eligible just last month, which I believe shows the enthusiasm for young people to come forward and play their part. At every point in our vaccination programme, we've been guided by the best clinical advice. The advice that we have received from the 4 Chief Medical Officers last week sets out their view that all 12 to 15-year-olds will benefit from vaccination against COVID-19. We will follow that advice and continue that vital path to ensure that we keep more and more people in this country safe. Thank you.
Miriam Cates to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just want to pass on my thanks to all honourable members who have contributed to this important debate. My thanks to the Minister and the Shadow Minister for their speeches as well. I think we're united in our desire to get back to normal. We're united in our desire for children to have normal education, and we're united in our praise of the vaccine programme, which has protected so many adults across this country. And I think to finish, I would just like to reiterate my honourable friend, the member for Bolton's question. What is success? Where does this end? How do we get back to normal? I don't believe the vaccine rollout amongst children will get us there. We need determined political leadership that puts the welfare of children front and centre, that ends educational disruption and allows us to move forward with their future.
The question is that this House has considered the vaccination of children against COVID-19. As many as are of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no.